we close out that series and head into Advent. This morning, our scripture comes from Numbers. That is the fourth book of the Bible. Numbers chapter 27. Numbers 27, verses 1 through 11. And I will read this in the New Revised Standard Version. Then the daughters of Zelophehad came forward. Zelophehad was son of Hefer, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, of the clans of Manasseh, son of Joseph. The names of his daughters were Malha, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting, saying, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the congregation of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the congregation of Korah, but died of his own sin, and he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give us a possession among our father's brothers." Moses brought their case before the Lord, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "The daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they are saying. You shall indeed let them possess an inheritance among their father's brothers and pass that inheritance of their father on to them. You shall also speak to the Israelites, saying, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall pass his inheritance on to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest kinsman of his clan, and he shall possess it. It shall be for the Israelites a statute and ordinance, as the Lord commanded Moses." Allow me to read just two verses from the book of Joshua. You don't have to turn to it. It's Joshua 17, verses 3 and 4. Now Zelophehad, son of Hefer, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, had no sons but only daughters. And these are the names of his daughters: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They came before the priest Eleazar and Joshua, son of Nun, and the leaders, and said, "The Lord commanded Moses to give us an inheritance along with our male kin." So according to the commandment of the Lord, Joshua gave them an inheritance among the kinsmen of their father. The word of God for the people of God. There are times in our lives when we have to set aside our grief. We have to set aside our despair. In the midst of our deep grief and our deep despair, we have to set that aside and take care of business. I don't know how many of you have been there. Actually, I know a few of you have been there because I have worked with you through this process. Somebody dies in your family, a loved one or a sibling or a child. And in the midst of your grief, you have to take care of business. There are people that need to be called, the undertaker. There are things that need to be sorted out, their home, their estate. There is planning that needs to happen. Their funeral, you got to call the church house. You got to call the pastor. You got to call the funeral home. Maybe for you, it wasn't a death of a person, but perhaps you lost your job. And in the midst of that grief of losing your job, the midst of the despair, the uncertainty, you don't have time to sit on the couch and sulk all day. You got to pull yourself up, brush your teeth, hopefully, do your hair, fill out some applications, submit your resume. You have to take care of business. The grief is there, yes. I'm not saying the grief goes away, but in the midst of the grief, the business still needs to be taken care of. The world is still turning. Life is still moving for everybody else. Perhaps you lost a relationship, you lost a friendship, a family ship, or perhaps you are dealing with the national crisis, a global crisis, and you are experiencing grief related to the suffering you are witnessing around the world. And in the midst of your grief about a situation, you can't just grieve. You got to jump into action. You got to call out the powers that be. You got to demand a better tomorrow for your children and your children's children. I asked myself earlier this week, what to the disenfranchised is grief? I'm echoing the words of Frederick Douglass when he said, what to the slave is the 4th of July. What to the disenfranchised is grief. Perhaps this is why author Ebony Janice wrote her book, All the Black Girls Are Activists. Because it's not enough to just be in the world when you are disenfranchised. One has to be and deal with the grief of their disenfranchisement. One has to exist and deal with the grief of their poverty. One has to exist while dealing with grief related to their bodies, related to misogyny, related to power struggles, all while trying to dream, trying to cook, trying to play, trying to rest. Because some of us don't have the privilege of just being. We gotta take care of business as well. And not just for ourselves, but also for our entire communities. Even in your own grief, you are still committed to the survival and the wholeness of an entire people. The weight of the world is on many of your shoulders in the midst of grief. The business of life consumes us in the face of death. There are times in our lives when in the midst of despair, we have to set aside our grief and take care of business. The daughters of Zelophehad have just lost their father. I pause here because they actually have names. And many of the women have gone unnamed in the Bible, so we're actually going to say their names together. It's Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They should not just merely be defined by their daddy's name as if they have no identity, as if they have no agency, as if they have no significance. This is important, as Hebrew Bible scholar Will Gaffney reminds us. Their story is so important that they are mentioned 5 different times in the text by name. They are mentioned 5 different times in Numbers 26, in Numbers 27, in Numbers 36, in the book of Joshua, and in the book of Chronicles. We call their names because so many women went unnamed in the biblical canon. Feminist Bible scholar Carol Meyer says that of the 1,426 personal names in the Hebrew Bible, only 111 are women. That is 9%. So Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah are the 9%. And so we speak their names aloud in a world that still censors bold women. That still censors bold women. That's another sermon. The sisters have just lost their father. Now, we don't know how their father died. We only know that his death is apparently connected to some sin, some act of transgression. We don't know what that act was, just that it wasn't the same sin of the congregation at Korah who had banded against the Lord. Now, in my sanctified imagination, I am imagining that the sisters are grieving. They are not only grieving the loss of their father, but there is no mother mentioned, so perhaps their mother is no longer with them as well. There are no brothers and there are no husbands, so they are grieving the question, who will take care of them? In a world where women have been deemed property, in a world where the property law says that they can't inherit that which their father left behind, I assume that some of their grief is connected to their father, yes, but another portion of their grief is connected to their uncertainty about their future. Where will they live? Their livelihood has been connected to their father's land, and in the midst of their despair, they have to muster up the strength to go before the male leaders and inquire about what will become of their future. In the midst of their grief, they are having to fight for security and dignity. They don't just get to grieve. That's a privilege. They have to spring into action. Oops. They have to put themselves in the line of fire to try to preserve what is left. In the midst of being sad, they have to take care of business. Now, some of you have been there, and you know what that feels like. And yes, and some folks praise this behavior. They call it resilience. We like to talk about all the people who are resilient, all those resilient people, those poor, they're so resilient. They love to call it resilience, and I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with leaning into your resilient behaviors, but there is something sinister about the expectation that one must turn their grief into action. That one must turn the most painful moment in their lives into a platform for prosperity and communal transformation for the marginalized. It seems that there is no grief apart from the demand for dignity and righteousness. We must sit with this rush to name something resilient. We must sit with how Emmett Till's funeral couldn't just be a funeral. How his mama couldn't just grieve his death. She had to become an activist as well. We have to sit with how the deaths of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd forced us out of our homes in the middle of a pandemic into the streets. We couldn't just grieve. Our grief had to be politicized. I'm not saying it's wrong to be drawn to righteousness. I'm saying what to the disenfranchised is grief. The sisters, Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah, y'all getting there. They stood before Moses. They stood before the priests. They stood before their leaders and the congregation at the entrance to the tabernacle, and they said four things. Our father has died. He had no sons. Why should his name die out? Give us his inheritance. I'm going to repeat that. They said four things. Our father has died. That is a statement of fact. He had no sons. That is a statement of fact. Why should his name die out? That is a rhetorical question. And give us his inheritance. That is a demand. That is not a question. They actually had a demand. They didn't say, can we have his inheritance? They said, give us what you owe us in front of the tabernacle. The law said that women couldn't inherit the land. But in her book, Womanist Midrash, Will Gaffney reminds us that Israel was virtually alone in excluding women from land ownership. All of the other cultures in the Near East, in the Mesopotamian region, broadly, cultures in Egypt, cultures in Elam, they all allowed for women to inherit their father's land. Israel was virtually alone in this exclusionary practice. So Moses goes, and he does what he does best. He inquires of the Lord. He goes into the temple, and he consults with God, and God responds to Moses almost immediately. God responds in affirmation of the daughters. God says, if a man dies and has no son, then the likely thing to do is to pass his inheritance on to his daughter. And if he has no daughter, to his brothers, and if he has no brothers, to his uncles, and no uncles to the next of kin. It seems like God comes to God's decision quickly. Now, I know that this story is truncated, and we don't know how long Moses was in there wrestling with God and if he was going back and forth, but it appears that God's mind was already made up. That God was already on the side of the sisters, that God was already and always on the side of the oppressed, always in favor of the chronically dispossessed, and God was just waiting for the humans to wake up and catch up. This is why we have to stop blaming God for our human-crafted rules and regulations. It seems like God already knew the answer, and it was an easy answer. Moses was the one that was having some difficulties here. So God tells Moses, give the daughters the land. And so it is, right? The sisters were grieving. They took care of business. They spoke up for themselves. God affirmed them. And we praise them to this day for their game-changing resilience. If it were that easy, I would sit down right now. But you know that there is a broader arc to the story. Was this game-changing after all? In Numbers 27, it would appear so. But if you skip ahead 9 chapters to Numbers 36, perhaps not. This is why we gotta read the whole story and not just a piece of the story. What we see 9 chapters down the line is that the daughters have not gotten their land yet. Now, why is that? Why is that? Because their uncles, the daughters' uncles, their father's brothers, present an appeal to amend the earlier adapted inheritance law, which allowed for Zelophehad's unmarried daughters to inhabit the land. Their argument to the congregation is that the women are unmarried, but what happens if they marry outside of the tribe? Now the land no longer belongs to our kin, it belongs to the man's kin. They are arguing about property. The uncles argue that the people would lose their land, and so the daughters have not yet received their inheritance. This is interesting to me because God said yes in chapter 27, but the uncle said no in chapter 36. These men are their relatives. The kids say it be your own people. It be your own people. These men are their relatives, and these men are more worried about property and power than the young woman's security and stability. And here comes Moses, reneging. I know some of y'all spades players know what that's like. Reneging. Here comes Moses, reneging on the offer. Moses had said yes earlier. I'm going to do what God told me to do. But the uncles start getting in his ear. And he starts to say that the uncles are right and that perhaps the women, in order to inherit their property, must marry within their tribe. He starts to put a caveat in there. Now, I'm going to pause here again because, you know, sometimes God be telling us stuff. You got to speak Ebonics sometimes. God be telling us stuff, and then we let others get in our ear. God has already given us the direction. God has already told us what we should be doing. Moses actually had a private conversation with God, and God said, do A, B, C, D, and E. And here he comes adding a caveat where God put no caveat. Moses reneges on the offer, and some might say, well, you know, Mia, you radical, womanist and feminist, a win is the win. Can't you just take the offer as it stands? They said you can have the land as long as you do what they tell you to do. You can have the land as long as you're a sharecropper. You're not even a slave, you're a sharecropper now. You can have it. And they say, oh, a win is a win. I'm not sure it's a win if there are restrictions. But can I throw one more thing your way? The land wasn't even their father's to begin with. We've been talking a lot about land recently. Their land was not their father's to begin with. It was land that was stolen from the Canaanites in war. It was already inhabited land. God had promised the Israelites somebody else's land. Now, I step theologically out of this framework because I don't believe that God is promising me something that belongs to somebody else. But in this case, it says that they took over Canaan in war, that this land was not even theirs to begin with, which means that the daughters of Zelophehad were going after their inheritance, going after stolen land via war. And this reminds me that some of us are caught up in such tangled webs. We are caught up in things that we didn't even weave ourselves. And it's a dangerous thing when we believe that our liberation is connected to inheriting something that never belonged to us in the first place. If you wanted true liberation, You'd have to desire more than being on equal footing with your enslaver, with thieves, if you want true liberation, because true liberation would require that you not only go for what is yours, but that you dismantle the systems that hold your inheritance. That means you might lose some seats at the table. You might lose some resources, some money, some opportunities, but true communal liberation would have meant that they would be calling to the carpet those who had taken the land in the first place. Now, I pull back here because I don't blame them. They are a product of the system that they grew up with. They are simply participating in the only system that they knew, but since we know better, we got to do better. We must imagine ways beyond fighting for seats at tables with wobbly legs. I don't know if I want a seat at your table that you've been excluding me from, if it comes with foolishness, if it comes with caveats, if it comes with all of these stipulations. I don't know if that's for me. I don't know if the inheritance is worth it, if it's the product of messy transactions, death dealing, blood, and agony. The sisters had stuck their necks out, demanding change for the sake of their security, and were met with antagonism and undermining. This sounds very familiar. Sometimes we find ourselves in similar situations. We are sticking our necks out. We are a part of a historically transactional faith that has led us to believe that righteousness comes with an earthly reward. Some of us have believed that if we just fight hard enough for their seat at the table, for that thing that we've been excluded from, that there will be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But what we've discovered is ain't no pot of gold, just a bunch of pebbles. Once we get in the room, it ain't all that. Sometimes so many of us are finding ourselves in the depths of despair, consumed with compounded grief after we did the brave thing. We did the bold thing. We made that big decision. We stepped out on faith only to be met with attacks on our character and disregard for our dignity. We find ourselves asking, what is the point? But I beg you to also think about this. Who will you be when sticking your neck out there does not render the reward you thought it would? What will your faith be like? How will you live? How will you thrive? How will you dream again when there is no external validation waiting on the other side of your courage? How will you begin to cultivate an internal reward, an internal affirmation in the midst of waiting for your inheritance in the wilderness? The women, I imagine, were probably at their wits' end. They had been waiting and waiting. We don't know where they were living and how they were sustaining themselves, but might I imagine that even in the midst of all of the waiting and the antagonism and the rejection and Moses changing his mind, there were moments of hope, I believe, in their community. It wasn't all for nothing. While the sisters were standing their ground, I imagine that there were little girls watching as they waited for what they had demanded. The little girls were taking mental notes of their courage in the face of crisis. I imagine that there were elders witnessing this work, wishing that they had had the courage to do the same thing generations ago. I imagine that their courage to some in the community who were also marginalized and silenced and disenfranchised, their courage set a precedent for every woman, for every marginalized person, every disenfranchised person that might debate speaking up or standing down. Perhaps the affirmation isn't in the end result, but in the journey itself. The inspirational journey that inspires us. We shouldn't be seeking that affirmation, that validation, that freedom from broken systems that aim to keep us bound. Perhaps instead of fighting to get a seat at the table, we should be walking away All while affirming ourself, affirming our dignity, affirming our wholeness. That's something that the uncles couldn't give them. Moses couldn't even give it to them, and he was their spiritual leader. I have to believe, friends, that my inheritance has to be beyond the things of this world. The contractual agreements about property, the rights to participate in the atrocities of harmful institutions. Sometimes we have to cultivate an internal affirmation because we might stand on business and it does not render us anything but heartache and grief. But that is not a sign that God is not with you. That is not a sign that God has left you or forgotten about you, but sometimes humans be humaning. Yeah. We are some interesting creatures. And while we're waiting for that desired thing to come to pass, we have to also be leaning into gratitude. While we are waiting, we also have to be affirming ourselves and our community. We have to say to ourselves sometimes as we look in the mirror in the morning, God, if I don't get the outcome that I desire, it's still thank you. It's still thank you for giving me the courage. God, if I don't get what I came for, if it does not come when I want it to come, God, it's still thank you for reminding me of my agency in this moment while I am waiting wearily in the wilderness. God, I will affirm myself and I will affirm my aspirations and I will affirm my desires. The daughters affirm themselves. And we see that even though Moses had reneged and their uncles had tried to do them in, they come back around to it in Joshua 17. They come back around to it in Joshua 17. We don't know how long of a time period was in between Numbers 36 and Joshua 17, but I have to imagine that they were waiting and they did not give up hope yet. Some years had passed and we don't know who had been taking care of them or how they had been living, but I had imagined that God was still taking care. In the midst of them not having a place to live or not having the inheritance that they desire, God was still moving on their behalf and working on the leadership and saying, try it again. They go to Joshua, who is now the leader. Moses has died. And they say, Joshua, 4 things. My dad died. He didn't have no sons. Why should his name die out? Give us our inheritance. And there is a stark difference. Joshua don't ask no questions. He don't go to consult God in the tent of tabernacle. He don't do nothing. He says, okay, the land is yours. There are no stipulations. There are no little tweak. Well, you got to do this and you got to do that. And if you just modify yourself just a little bit to assimilate, to fit in, Joshua says, the land is yours. Everything that you have been fighting for, everything that you have been working for, the security that you desire is yours. No questions asked. And I was thinking, were they happy? The song said, I just want to be happy. Were they happy? Were they fatigued? I wonder what it feels like to live in the interstices of gratitude and grief, to say, God, I am grateful for this thing you have granted me, but it has caused me so much grief. Can I even enjoy it? I wonder how they felt after they had spent so much of their lives fighting to be in spaces that had rejected them. We spend so much of our lives fighting to be in spaces that reject us, that neglect us, that try to keep us down. And when we finally get into some of these cantankerous spaces, grief. When we finally get a seat at the table, sometimes it ain't all unicorns and cotton candy and rainbows. Sometimes it's grief. We put so much energy into evening the playing fields, and then we get there and grief. Sometimes our steadfastness comes with grief. And in the midst of that grief, might I offer that we are called to a game-changing perspective that allows us to shift that grief into gratitude. God, this fight was hard. I'm hurting. My body hurts from this fight. My soul hurts from this fight. My mind hurts from this fight. But I have gratitude anyhow because you kept me in this fight. You sustained me in this fight. You provided for me in the midst of a lack of provision. You gave me sustainability where there was none. And so all I can do right now to shift this gratitude, this grief to gratitude, is to say thank you. Thank you for holding us and keeping us in the battle. The daughters of Zelophehad's story ends there. Their faithfulness is praised. Some people know the inner workings, others don't, of what they had to go through. But I had to imagine that at the end of the day, it was still praise be to God. Thank you for even having the courage, the wherewithal to inspire generations. 8,000 and 10,000 years later, people are still saying the names of Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. Regardless of the ups and downs and the ins and outs of their battles, people are still saying their names and calling on them as ancestors, those who embolden us and empower us and remind us of the courage that is within us, and also the charge to affirm ourselves in the midst of antagonism and rejection. Let that be your hope today. The hope is not a promise of something special at the end. I wish I could promise you all the good things. You get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car. But our faith walk does not work like that. Sometimes the hope is God with us. Sometimes the hope is be not dismayed, whatever betide, God will take care of us. Sometimes the hope is God walks with us and God talks with us and God is faithful as much as we are faithful in the battle, in the struggle. There is joy and there is hope. And the women remind us of that. So let us take that in this morning as we live in the intersection of grief and gratitude. Let us pray. God, we are grateful for your faithfulness. We are grateful that you have been faithful as we have been faithful. You have been faithful right alongside us. God, we are grateful for the witness of these women, for the daughters, for the disenfranchised, for those who were silent before but felt an ounce of courage enough to stand on business. God, we are grateful for the reminder that our affirmation and that our validation does not come from outside of us, but within us. And that we may not see the fruits of our labors in our lifetime, but there is somebody watching us. There is somebody witnessing our courage and mustering up courage and strength of their own. Remind us of who you have made us to be, fearfully and wonderfully, in your image, co-creators, co-inspirers, co-instigators for the sake of life, for the sake of liberation, for the sake of communal transformation. Let it be so. Amen. We invite you to join us in song as we